Should we get going, and then as people join, we can always go back. So, welcome. Thank you for joining us for this panel session.
Sorry, I'll have to disconnect for a second to.
Okay, we haven't got any slides.
On that side.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, whilst we're doing technical stuff, I'll introduce myself and ask our panelists, our esteemed panelists, to introduce themselves as well. So I'm Gabby Silver. I just finished at Brunswick, which is a company that looks after the reputation of a number of different verticals, but I was leading the healthcare practice. And one of the key areas there was helping Big Pharma on the whole try to better describe their value and contribution to society, to all the stakeholders with which they interact. And clearly, pricing, access, transparency was at the core of those conversations and the desire of those companies to open a different sort of dialogue. I'm about to join and become the GM of the Lloyd's Pharmacy clinical home care business at very different end of the delivery of patient care. But in all regards, I suppose the question we want to ask today is the model working? Is the way that we deliver medicines, price medicines, and open up our doors as to how we create those innovations where we want it to be, or have we got a longer way to go? I suppose one of the things that we need to consider is that we are in a different era now, a very exciting era, an era of really specialized, personalized innovations. But we come from an era of delivering large blockbusters that had population-level health impact, and we priced accordingly. But we're now going into that targeted, specialized world. And is the model that we have relevant for both? Can we still justify the costs of our medicines by the costs of R&D? Is that a valid argument in any way, shape, or form? And we'll come on to discuss that. And what is the attitude of the industry to having that sort of transparent conversation, and as I say, opening up their doors? So I'm now going to pass over to the panelists. I'd like each of you to introduce yourselves. And following your introduction, we're going to start this on an upbeat moment. So I'd like you to describe to us what you think is worthy of praise about the UK pricing and transparency issue that we're discussing today. What could be seen as role modelling for the rest of international markets? So what is it that we should be proud of in terms of the way the system runs today? So I'll pass over to you, Leslie.
That's a hell of a lot of questions. Thank you. I'm Leslie Galloway. I'm chairman of an organisation called the Ethical Medicines Industry Group. It's or EMIG as we call it. It's a trade body for small and medium-sized pharma companies. We started in 2005 with 17 companies, and today we have 280 companies and organisations. About half of our members are pharma. 90% of those belong only to EMIG, which means we reflect 50% of the volume of branded medicines in the UK. But 80% of our pharma members are small and medium-sized companies. But it's important to bear in mind that 100 million in pharma terms is probably medium, not even medium, small to medium. So it's a very interesting, vibrant organisation. We give free membership to patient groups. We have 23 patient groups. Excuse me. And the reason for that is everywhere I go, I hear that patients are at the heart of everything we do. And it's a load of old, I'll use the word tripe on this occasion, because budgets are at the heart of everything that people do. But there's some very practical reasons as well, because companies come to the UK with a phase 3 expecting to get through NICE. And there are patient groups like Myeloma UK, Cancer Research UK, who can help companies through the clinical trial networks develop the data they need to present their proposition to NICE properly. So coming back to your question, and I think I can remember, I'm not even sure I can remember any of them. But what I will say, what's good, the word good, stuck in my mind. The issue I have with pricing is that all too often I go to conferences and people talk about a part of it. They don't talk about the whole thing. They don't talk about the ecosystem. Now we can talk about, on the one hand, companies that do that and push the prices high as they can globally. And usually the prices come from the US and then they come to the UK and the EU and they're perceived to be very high. But there are a lot of mechanisms in the EU, UK in particular, that prevent that list price being paid by the NHS. There are things like the PPRS, the Pharmaceutical Price Regulation Scheme, which is about to be renegotiated, and I'm happy to talk about that. We have what's called the CMU, the Commercial Medicines Unit, now called the Strategic Commercial Unit, part of the NHS. It used to be part of DH. They conduct branded tenders and drive down the price and save hundreds of millions over a period of years for the NHS. And then we have patient access schemes, part of NICE guidance. 60% of NICE guidance is accompanied by a patient access scheme. Now, the highest discount I ever heard for a medicine in a patient access scheme was 90%. Now, you can't get better than that, but it depends, of course, where the price started. So there's a lot to be discussed, and it's about, as much as anything else, the NHS using medicines. It's about being attractive in the UK as a place to invest. Yes, let's talk about how the price gets there. What do we do with this? But all too often, even when we get the price right, it never gets to a patient, or only a few patients. So I'll stop there, and you can throw questions at me.
I'm Ken Jones. I'm currently the CEO of Ininsure Biotechnology, which is a drug delivery company that's focusing on microneedle patches to deliver medicines. Prior to that, I worked for Astellas Yamanuchi. I started their headquarters here, actually in Staines, with 4 people in a Regis office and grew to 600 people. I set up the Health Economic Market Access Organization, was involved in a lot of negotiations from the first-in-class drugs they launched as well as best-in-class drugs. So I'm very well in tune with some of the challenges we have. I think the positive for me is that the framework is there. It is defined. And I think it's good. I think the fact that they have qualities as a way of determining, we could argue whether qualities are good or bad, but at least you kind of have a roadmap, unlike some other countries. I think the challenge, again, goes back to really how the process is managed. And there's also internal capabilities, both from a company point of view, but also from the NICE point of view, in which we've been in some processes where the same drug is getting evaluation positive and negative from 2 different processes. So clearly there is internal capability challenges we have. The reality is we don't work in a world that has one payer with one system with one budget. So if that were to occur, I think it would be easier to determine what value is. But you have to realize that we have to understand that some of our diseases are cured or treated in a certain budget constraint area, and to ignore that is difficult because you're ignoring the realities of politics between health economics and the actual delivery of care. And the most important notion is that governments ration medicine. It's not about giving access. If you think about what they're trying to do, is they're rationing it. So how do we manage that reality? GDP is growing about 2% per annum. Innovation is between 10 and 15%. The UK, 10% of GDP is what healthcare costs. It's projected to be 30%. So clearly the gap of the coalitions, co-systems are at a breaking point. And the question is, how do we help facilitate that? There's an opportunity here where we can hopefully focus on being honest and transparent to be able to treat the patients the way they should be treated.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Nigel Blackburn. I'm Director of Drug Development for Cancer Research UK. So I run an internal group that develops innovative new cancer treatments, working from candidate through to proof of concept. Spent most of my career in drug development. Previous to that, I was in a couple of biotechs and then with Big Pharma for like 20 years. I think the high spot for us right now is the Reformed Cancer Drug Fund. I think it's leading the way in terms of playing around with value-based pricing, outcome-based pricing. As far as we're concerned, we want patients to get early access to innovative drugs that work, and we think this is a step in the right direction in terms of trying to lead the way there.
Great, thank you.
And I'm Jennifer Lee, so I'm the Director of Health Economics, Market Access, Reimbursement and Advocacy at Janssen. So my role and my team cover obviously health economics, market access, pricing, real-world evidence, outcomes research, and patient engagement and government affairs, so obviously all of external affairs. Previous to that, I was at Sanofi in a regional market access role based out of Singapore, and before that in Australia. in health economics, and then before that in Canada, where I'm from, as a university biochemist. So I have worked in a lot of the HTA markets, which use the cost per quality. I fully agree with Ken that having a measure of value is a good thing, obviously, and that is what I think the UK does well in terms of there is a value assessment. It's not just about let's just get the lowest price, right? Which I have major concerns about the developments recently with NHS England basically moving a lot more towards that. I think it would be very worrisome, and you would hear NICE saying this themselves, that if we were to move away from the value assessment piece. Again, I mean, I don't necessarily agree that the quality is the best measure, but at least it's a measure of value. So I think that's what the UK does really well, and I would really, really hate to see that. In terms of globally, the UK definitely punches above its weight in terms of R&D because of the great science here. So if you look at global sales across big pharma, it's roughly 2% on average in some of the big companies, are UK sales. So that's kind of nothing, really. It's a drop in the ocean globally. But in terms of R&D, you know, between 6 and 10% of companies' R&D is based here because of the, you know, the Golden Triangle and the great scientists here. And, you know, what I'm really worried about, to be honest, is the impact of Brexit on that. Will we lose that science? Will we lose that R&D base? Will we lose, you know, top international candidates wanting to come to the UK to study, to research, to live and to work? That's a real concern for me. So I think, you know, that's one of the urgent things we need to address to keep the UK at the top of its game.
Great, thank you. And we will come to the Brexit discussion a bit later. Just before I move on to my first question to you, I have a question to the audience here. As you hear the panelists talk about what's good, what's worthy of recognition and potentially of replication in other parts of the world, is there anything else that we haven't mentioned? Are there aspects of the UK pricing and access schemes that you think really hold themselves up to review and praise?
Forgive me because I may have missed the first part. I came into the papers to the panel, but I know in the past there were some programs around essentially paying by results, so essentially the MS products went through a process that would be patient results, then would be subject to all that. I'm not sure if you talked about that or whether that's worthy of discussion or whether that sort of approach still continues.
Look, I can tell you directly, as Janssen, 10 years ago, we launched the Velcade response scheme for bortezomib, which is a drug for multiple myeloma. And that was prior to the introduction of PASLU at NICE, which is now moving into NHS England. And that is an outcomes-based scheme. So essentially, if the patient doesn't respond, Janssen refunds the money to the NHS, right? And that is truly, you know, outcomes-based care. I can also tell you that I'm under a lot of pressure from the Department of Health to get rid of it because they don't like it. And sadly, 10 years later, if you look at the NICE website and look at the approved list of patient access schemes, you will not see another outcomes-based scheme there. And that is absolutely counter to what the Accelerated Access Review says, what the Life Science Industrial Strategy says, what the NHS's own policies say in terms of outcomes-based commissioning. Globally, where countries are moving towards value-based healthcare. So interestingly, when you take a step back and you away from what's said, you know, the rhetoric, what's actually happening in reality is moving much too slowly.
And is that the cost of administering those schemes? Is it really the practicalities and the logistics rather than the intent behind it?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely, admin burden. And to be honest, I mean, if I were an NHS pharmacist or clinician, you know, working extremely long hours, having many other priorities, completely overburdened, I would feel the same. So I can completely understand why they are against it. You know, so something needs to be done to address that.
Okay, so that's very helpful, and thank you for that question. So let's start at the beginning, which is the age-old sort of justification for the price of drugs globally in this country, which is the costs of R&D. And yet there is very, very little transparency around the real costs of R&D, and we hear figures that, you know, 2.x billion in the cost, and some have said you can develop a drug for just over 100,000 euros. So where are we in that? And what is the obligation of the pharmaceutical industry and the biotech industry to start to open up their doors to the true costs of R&D so that people, if it is at that higher end of the spectrum really understand better the systems and the investment in getting a drug to market. And I will pose that to you, Leslie, to
I
begin
think one
with.
of the challenges is that companies are competitive, and therefore they are secretive, and they don't ever want to reveal what they're doing to anyone else in case they copy it. And that's probably one of the underlying principles. There are probably others, because I'm not an R&D person, so I can't really give you a very full answer on that, but that's the sort of thing I hear about not sharing clinical data, et cetera, et cetera. It's for IP, it's for competitive reasons. And until we change that attitude, it won't change.
Nigel,
So that
did you have a thought?
Yeah.
You've worked on both sides of the fence.
I think it's a really interesting point. I mean, does anybody in the room think that we are overly profitable as an industry, as a biotech and pharma industry? Do you think we're overly profitable? Do you think we're generating obscene levels of profit? Because if you don't believe that and you think that we just get a fair return on our investment, well, why aren't we more transparent about what we do? I know it's not directly parallel, but you know, the new iPhone X, £1,000. I wonder how much that costs to make. I've got no idea, probably a couple of hundred or something like that. And yet no one's screaming about transparency of pricing for technology or for cars or for other very, it's products that require high levels of investment akin to new drugs. But we don't share it, and we never have done. And you get comments like yesterday in the opening session where, you know, it referenced the fact that, I think it was the guy from NICE was saying they'd asked one of the companies to talk about how it reached a price, and the company just refused to engage on that matter. And yet, if we believe our profits are not excessive, why are we not doing that? I don't quite understand it. Is it because we believe it's too complicated? Is it because we actually do have something to hide? I don't know. But I think going forward, we're going to have to be much more transparent and explain, you know, how much drugs cost to develop, regardless of whether that's disclosing competitive information or. But I can't see any choice at all.
I saw a comment from the...
Just a comment, really. It's just that, you know,
Can you say where you're from, just...
Sorry, my name's Tina Fraser. I just ran the patient centricity panel next door with somebody from NICE. I work for a small biotech company. My background is rare disease, and I'm a trustee of a rare disease charity, so I'm very interested in having affordable treatments, you know, being made available. And I have experience within the companies that I've worked, the conversations within the room with the management team about pricing, which have nothing to do directly with the cost of producing the product. It's about what the market will bear, what competitive products are out there, and so on. So, you know, it makes me shiver. But just going back to something we were discussing in the other room, and that is about driving value and demonstrating that you can create value in different ways. For example, making sure that you have compliance or correct adherence, that you're not throwing money down the drain in the NHS with 60% of drugs that never get taken, and so on. So there are other ways in which we can get efficient if we put pressure on companies where cost is concerned. And I would like to see cost arguments, the value of a treatment, being part of the clinical trials evaluation process. If you want to come and do trials here, we have to have a conversation about the value that your product is going to deliver. I think we should start in R&D.
Yeah, can I say something? I know you're probably going to say more important things than me, but just to put the pressure on you. I have a great concern. I've had it for many years, which is this phrase, cost effectiveness. Because, first of all, the cost comes first, and it's usually interpreted as price. And it disguises and confuses people in terms of, well, what are we actually getting for our money? I would really like to understand effectiveness better and be really, really clear. And this is underlined by a study that was published recently. It was written up in Pharma Focus. 57% of cancer drugs that were approved between 2009 and 2013, they demonstrated progression-free survival, but not overall survival. So these patients, it doesn't matter what the price is, may well have been taking toxic medications that were giving them awful side effects and, you know, destroying the remaining quality of life that they had for a couple of years to get an extra 3-6 months life. That's the big issue for me. So it's understanding what are we really getting, and then we decide, okay, what's it worth? there are big challenges in that particular issue because progression-free survival is really it's a reasonable indicator, and the only way you know is when you die what the overall survival is. So it's with hindsight. But there must be something we can learn from that, and I think we need to try and learn. So, sorry.
Well, I think first discussing profits on a business that is making profits off of illnesses is quite difficult from the beginning. I mean, that in itself, people don't like the idea that we can make any profit on people's illnesses. So whether it's 1% or 10 or 20%. I think second thing people forget is we have to get right first time round. So if iPhone X, charge $1,000, that's paying because they have to compensate revisions, revise it, correct it, and the rest of it. But in our case, it needs to be right first time round as best as possible. So you have to pay for the mistakes. So in the price of costing is the 1,000 molecules that fail to get that one that may get to phase 3, and it may need its endpoints if it doesn't. So actually the costing is paying for the failures. But people don't want to talk about that, right? But the reality is, science is not perfect. It's serendipitous. You get things you don't expect. And most disease medicines I know fail in the first indication. And someone had the idea to do it somewhere else, and actually it worked. And there's several in previous Astellas labs we know is true. So, if it were a clean, straight line to get from an idea innovation to clinical study to approval, I think we'd be in a different world, but that's not the reality. And I think the challenge is, in our price, is the mistakes to get to that one that works.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to fully agree, Ken, I mean, this is the problem with that, and I don't necessarily, I don't agree that, you can just say, okay, here's the cost of manufacturing this, 10 pence or whatever, these numbers that they throw out, and then therefore, why are you not charging it? I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. And I don't think it's fair as well to say that every single company just sits around and going, well, how much can we charge? Because I can tell you that's not what we do at Johnson & Johnson. That is not what we do when we look at pricing for medicines. We absolutely look at value. We also look at different countries, and we have a whole global public health program where we give a lot of our medicines away for free in countries where we know people simply cannot afford to pay for them. So we also cover the cost of all of that. So it's not as simple to just say, there's not a bunch of people just sitting around the room going, "Ooh, how much can we charge?" That's not how it works. The issue we've got, I think, in today's, and it's something you said, Gabby, at the beginning, in today's world of medicine, of drug development, it's very different to, say, 20 years ago when some of the value assessment frameworks were set up, like when NICE was set up in 1999, for example. That was the era of, you had big kind of blockbuster statins, you had drugs that kind of worked, they weren't as targeted, so they worked across a lot more patients, and they weren't as specialized. Now, if you look at the global pipelines of the big companies, there's about 60% that are oncology, right? And clearly, we're on the vanguard here of something new in cancer. If you look at where HIV was in 1994, before the first reverse transcriptase came out, AIDS was a death sentence. Now, people live with it chronically. If you look at what happened with Hep C, right, in 2008, 2009, when the first drugs started coming through where, this is looking towards a cure for some people, and now we have drugs that are cures for most people in Hep C. We are starting to see in cancer, for example, different combinations used from different companies, which throws up a whole bunch of other issues. But we're starting to see functional cures in some early stage myeloma, for example. So it is a very incredibly exciting time. And so the regulator, I think, has recognized this, and that goes to the earlier discussion about early evidence, right? So the issue you've got is if you have a drug that is highly potent and is seen to be, working very well in a subgroup of patients, for example, the Independent Data Monitoring Review Committee will stop the trial and say you must allow patients to cross over. So obviously that causes a lot of concerns for somebody like NICE. Well, what would have actually happened if patients had carried on? But from a company perspective, it's very difficult to ever determine that because you can't not stop the trial. It would be unethical to do so. You'll never know what that true value is. That's part of the issue. And then you're given a license, sometimes based on phase 2 single-arm trial data, very early on, because of early clinical promise. EMA gives that to you, or FDA, breakthrough designation. And then you get to NICE, and NICE says, well, you don't have a comparator arm. You don't have the proper comparator evidence for the NHS. This is way too early. You might not even have median in PFS. So what is the value of this actual drug? And that's where we are today. So I think it's incumbent upon us as the industry and anybody that, at patient groups, anybody that cares about patients, NICE, NHS England, to come together to decide on what is the value framework for the 21st century in this era of highly targeted medicines. Because unfortunately, we're not at the stage yet where you actually know before you give the patient the drug whether it's going to work in that particular patient. Some you do, diagnostics, there's a few, but overall, it is very difficult to determine. And nowadays, maybe it might only work in 1 in every 10 patients. But for those 1 in 10, those patients are still alive years later. So we need to determine how do we deal with drug development now, which is very different to drug development 20 years ago.
Well, especially with orphan drug designations now, globally, the regulatory status has to catch up,
Yeah.
and the reimbursement has to catch up. If not, there's no point giving the designation of orphan drug. There's no point. Why do it?
There's also a big issue for the NHS in being able to actually realise the value of medicines. It's all very well, for example, Hep C medicines, they obviate the need for liver transplants, but they don't close down all the liver transplant units. What they do is they do other liver transplants for patients who don't have Hep C. And I can think back to another side of that argument, which was medicine for chronic eczema, chronic hand eczema, which is very, very debilitating. It was about 5 years ago. And they, NICE approved it, but the current treatment at that time, and probably still is ultraviolet treatment. Now, the problem that the hospitals had was we are deriving an income from primary care for this PUVA. If we have to stop it, we lose that income, and now we have to pay for the drug as well. Now, my question was, excuse me, where is the patient in all of this? And the patient was nowhere to be seen. So there are a lot of very significant issues for the NHS in being, it's not a criticism, it's an old institution. They are not built from an accounting point of view, they do it on an annual basis, etc., etc. They are archaic in many ways. So here they are trying to realize the value of very high-tech, modern medicines, and we need to think about that.
Can I just mention something that we're doing with a charity? Yeah.
Sure.
So we've partnered with Greater Manchester Health and Social Care Partnership, and we're actually doing some research at the moment on outcomes-based pricing. So the first phase of the research, we're looking to actually define what outcome criteria we'll use. Obviously, this is cancer. And then we're going to mine data sets to actually look in and say, how would those criteria work with existing data sets? And then finally moving actually to a live pilot using those criteria and saying, well, how would you actually reimburse that drug and what would it cost? So we're hoping to try and inform these discussions that are going on at the moment to truly pilot outcomes-based pricing.
And my question to you there, just to speak to the point earlier, is how core is the patient in helping define those criteria for success?
They're part of the process.
Okay. And I think, it's something that we absolutely, when we talk about value frameworks, it's value through multiple different stakeholder lenses. Everyone has got a slightly different justification and positioning in the whole thing, but the patient must be core.
Absolutely, yeah.
I know there was a comment there.
Yeah, it was, so my name's Hassan Abubakar, I work for Pharmacyte, largest voluntary fund for bio research in the UK, and it's about routes to access, NICE and NHS specialised initiative around the blue vanguard of drugs, having personalised gene therapy. Single administration is inherently the process of literally make drugs available on the market, and will it need to change? If we're looking, for instance, Smart Therapy to have a gene therapy for legal congenital amaurosis, single administration, the FDA are likely to approve it in January. It's probably about $1 million per person. How does the system deal with that sort of price, considering that this is a potentially one
Curative.
for the rest of someone's life? How do you meet that challenge?
I mean, hugely complex, and I'll come to you, Jen, just because I think you've had experience and the size of the business at J&J in terms of looking at different markets, and you know, whether it's the CAR-T therapies that have come to market, which are revolutionary and hugely exciting, not without their risk, but unbelievable. But you know, a pricing based around what's the cost of a bone marrow transplant as a benchmark. So give us some thoughts about these hugely sort of significant innovations and how pricing might work around those.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's why I said my earlier point that I don't think Big Pharma has the solution to it. I don't think the NHS has the solution to it. I don't think NICE has the solution. I don't think patient advocacy. I think everybody needs to come together, right? And I think to solve that issue, because absolutely, you know, $1 million US per patient is an incredible price. But does it cure you for life and that's it? Yes. But then Leslie's earlier point, well, then what's the value to the NHS? Because whatever resources that patient would have consumed, they're just going to use for something else anyway, right? So how do you ever assess what that value is? It's a continuum. It's constant, right? And these, as I said, you know, the systems that NICE, PBAC in Australia, CADTH in Canada set up, or 20 years ago in Canada, Australia, were based on here and now, you know, one stagnant point in time, HTA, right? So you're assessing the value of something, putting it into the system at that point in time. But it's a bit false because it's dynamic. As soon as something new comes into the market and changes the patient pathway, that cost effectiveness assessment is actually irrelevant. So it's almost like you need to do real-time HTA. You need to be constantly updating it. Nobody has time for that. We don't even have the data infrastructure, sadly, in this country to do that. But that would be the ideal way. I don't think any one person or one stakeholder has the solution. I think we need to come together. But what I would say is if you look at what happened with Hep C and you look at what happened with Sovaldi, clearly, you know, governments around the world said enough is enough and that price is too high. And there was a lot, you know, we all know the press all around that. And essentially that is where the NHS England affordability test came from, because cost effectiveness is not the same as affordability. Let's be honest, that's what happened, right? Politically. So they said, fine, these drugs are incredibly cost effective. They cure patients, but we can't afford them as the NHS. So we need to do something. So again, I understand why it all happened. So if you're looking at things that are, you know, I think it was about 80,000, maybe 40,000 pounds in the UK, 80 grand in the US. That's nothing compared to the 1 million that you just talked about, or the CAR-T, which I think is around 400,000 US, that was just approved by the FDA. So, you know, these are massive issues, and I'm not going to stand here pretending I know the solution, but it's dialogue. It's getting around the table and sorting it out.
But you know, there are a lot of big issues that may mean that issue doesn't actually arise in the UK. You know, we have a whole string of challenges for pharma, only one of which is Brexit. And Simon Stevens is not going to get fired for not using new medicines. He's got a list of other things on his plate that he'll get fired for if he doesn't get it right. So medicines are at the bottom of the pile. Now, if the environment in the UK doesn't change, the people who make the decisions about launching in the UK, especially with Brexit, are going to look at us as a 3% of the global market, offshore island next to the big market. And we'll get medicines 2 years after they get them in France or Germany and elsewhere. So there's a lot of stuff that we really do need to fix, and it's back to talking about the whole problem. We need to talk about the whole ecosystem. Industry so often points the finger at NICE, et cetera, and the government points the finger at the industry about pricing. We need to talk about the issues, and it's about people who do not bring a self-interest to the table, who can help and understand the issues, who can actually start talking about solutions. The Accelerated Access Review took 3 years. I sat on the reference group for 18 months, and I was starting to self-harm. It was... And what did it do for us? It brought us NHS affordability. And, you know, we really need to think very carefully. It was too broad an approach, but we need to talk about the big issues in the ecosystem that we really want to fix and can do. The PPRS is an enormous opportunity to do that as well.
One thing I think that's come up and that we talk about here is that we're never going to make progress unless we start to collect robust data, whether it's real-world evidence, whether it's data right at the beginning of the clinical trials that we were talking about that focused on the patient outcomes and the social impact outcomes that matter broadly. I look at the NHS and I struggle to see, and we'll come on to Brexit in a moment as it being a potential opportunity, but I struggle to see how we think that system, albeit having the potential of this longitudinal data set that we all look at with such potential, but it cannot collect at the moment even the most basic of data. We have no systems, no capability, no skill set in place to really start to collect those data sets that are going to help us judge which is working, which needs rebate. You know, we read in the Accelerated Access Review that we're going to have these regional medicine optimization committees that are going to take away medicines that aren't working. But on the basis of what data, I ask? And so my question, both to the audience and to the panel here, is, are we kidding ourselves, really, that the NHS has got any of those capabilities to really push this forward if we're not actually collecting the data that's going to help us make decisions?
I think there's some pockets of good practice.
Good.
I think there are some decent cancer data sets out
Yeah.
there. They're not national, they're regional. But you're absolutely right, and I think unless these data sets become much more robust and nationwide, we're not going to be able to answer those questions. And I think it's up to all of us, as you say, to work together to get those data sets sorted out, because otherwise how on earth are we going to judge outcomes to then decide what we're going to pay?
Yeah, I mean, look, I can speak from firsthand about this. The NHS has a massive opportunity on a more positive note because you have one NHS number from birth to death, right? And you have the world's single biggest, fully taxpayer-funded healthcare system. You also have the world's single biggest healthcare employer, right? In terms of, so think about that. That is a massive opportunity. Sadly, it's not a closed loop system, and a lot of the data sources aren't linked. So, for example, if you go to a small hospital, you know, up in Yorkshire, for example, and they don't transfer your records down to your GP in London, well, you know, unless you tell them to do that, it's not going to happen. I can tell you firsthand experience. What if you're an elderly patient with a whole bunch of comorbidities and you don't know, you just assume that your GP is going to know that they prescribed you a whole bunch of medicines up there, maybe you had a surgery, they don't know. It's shocking. There's also no electronic prescribing in some trusts still in the UK. So there is an opportunity, but it's going to require massive investment, not just in money, but also in people to enter these data. And I refer back to my earlier comment about the Velcade response scheme. It's because they don't have time. You know, if you're a clinician or a pharmacist, you've got 1,000 other things to do. You're, you know, entering data into a system about what patient got which, that's not your priority. So we need to get real about that as well. If you look at Sweden, for example, and I know it's obviously a much smaller population than the UK, but they do have that closed loop, and they have one, what they call, you know, their NHS equivalent to an NHS number from birth to death, and they do track, and they've got amazing data sets. You just need to look at the Karolinska Institute data to see, and that's at a national level. So I think this needs to be a priority. I think this, in order to do outcomes-based commissioning, in order to actually figure out whether what we're spending on the NHS is actually working for patients, most importantly, but also is most efficient. It's definitely the solution. How we get there, I don't know. But, you know, Nigel, your earlier comment about the Cancer Drugs Fund. So I can, again, tell you firsthand, SACT is incomplete, unfortunately. And if you have a new drug where your comparator arm is not a licensed standard of care, which is often the case in areas of high unmet need in cancer, particularly rarer cancers, you cannot collect that data in SACT because it's not complete. No one's collecting data on unlicensed, you know, medicines. So you'll never answer the question that NICE needs to know: how effective is that drug in the real life NHS? So basic stuff where there's pockets of, you know, good practice, or where they're, you know, Public Health England's really trying to get their act together to make SACT work, it's still not working. So the reason is the admin burden, and let's be honest, there's not enough money being put in the NHS to deal with the admin burden and to hire more people and to give people more time.
Any other comments from the audience?
Yeah, hi. I'm Andrew Wilson, I'm a medical director at Vertex. I'm also a GP, so I can see things from both sides. And so I'm not sure value is the main issue here. You've all touched on it. It's the budget impact. We're talking about the NHS in England. It's a complete mess. And I can tell you, because I work in it, and I've had personal experience. You know, people still waiting for cancer diagnoses for 2-3 months. A&E waiting's going up. You can't get an ambulance. And we're talking about innovation. I work for Vertex. We're right at the heart of innovation in cystic fibrosis. So is the NHS ready for innovation? I'm not sure it is. So it's a huge, and we have to all, as Jennifer said, there's no simple solution here. We have to all get around the table. We've got NICE is great. We've got a way to assess cost effectiveness, but I'm not sure that's the issue. We can collect amazing data, but where's the money? So I don't have a solution, but it'd be good to hear any of the thoughts.
Well, my question there would be, you're absolutely right, the NHS is in chaos, it's on its knees, and we have an unbelievable skill in R&D expertise in genomics. There's lots to be very proud about what the UK has contributed. And then we have looming over the top of that Brexit. And I don't wish to add further, disaster sort of scenarios. But we are potentially going to become a total irrelevancy. So your Vertex innovations that are developing, the UK will not be on the radar screen, will not be after the US, the 28 markets in Europe, Japan probably to follow in advance of where the UK will fall so far behind in terms of adopting those innovations. I'm not sure we'll be looking to pay for them. I mean, actually what we'll be doing is looking to pay to retain a skilled workforce so we can deliver even the most basic levels of care. I don't think we will be even trying to compete in terms of cancer outcomes, in terms of early adoption of innovative medicines. So, I mean, that's a doomsday scenario, but where we are now, from my perspective, I also sit on a trust in the NHS, and I can't see much that looks with any particular hope on the horizon. Do you have more hope?
The French writer once said, he actually probably wrote it as well, no problem is resistant to concerted thought. And I carry that with me all the time. If you really, really want to find a solution, understand the problem, and where you can do things. Now, I could add to your list about the doom and gloom that faces the UK. We have the most complex market access system in Europe. We have full processes in the UK, and the English is the most complex. That's before you get to Brexit. Then you have NICE going to charge for technology appraisals. And even if you get a positive technology appraisal, NHS in turn can say, well, we can't afford you. So what is a small biotech saying about that? We have a complex system of approval in specialized commissioning that's opaque, and it changes from year to year. We have the RMOCs, the Regional Medicines Optimization Committee. It's a Kafkaesque structure of committee after committee after committee that's focused entirely on horizon scanning. Not all new medicines go to horizon scanning. And it's a way of keeping industry at bay. Now, this new strategic commercial unit at the NHS, it used to be the CMU at the DH, and they're all focused on tenders for existing products. Now they're going to be 50% tenders and 50% focused on new medicines, the pricing of new medicines. Now, this is where it gets interesting when you start to link stuff together. The PPRS, we will pay around £3 billion in rebates by the end of next year when the current scheme finishes. £3 billion goes to DH, the Treasury, the NHS. It's allowed for in their budgets. So people who make the decisions about prescribing don't sense or feel any benefit from those rebates. We have the statutory regulations, which will be changed in April next year. And that will provide for a rebate on all new medicines. Currently, they're excluded from the PPRS. And I could go on. But I still see the PPRS. I talk about the PPRS as being an opportunity. One of the things I would like to happen in the PPRS is those rebates, the whole thing is rewired, such that the rebates go into a new medicines fund that will pay for medicines approved by NICE, medicines approved on the specialized commissioning policy, medicines perhaps, if the RMOCs ever get their act together, to approve them. These RMOCs will be looking at all the medicines not assessed by NICE, and that's 60% of all new medicines. NICE only assessed 40%. And the reason they don't assess the remaining 60% is because they're not going to have a very big impact on the medicines bill. Those are the very medicines that the NHS needs. So, NICE is effectively a shop window for the very expensive medicines. So there is a way through it. I'm not prepared to lose sleep over the stuff that's going to happen I have no control over. I'm trying to fix the bits we can fix. Because there is a future. There will be a life after Brexit. We will all die one day. But there's going to be an awful lot of fun in the middle. And I think we should focus on that.
I mean, I think what you said is right. It's about affordability. That's the real issue. And having worked and lived in the US, Japan, I've lived in France and Italy, UK. The one thing no one talks about is charging patients for doctor visits. There's an income stream, right? I'm really sorry, but it's an amazing system you pay nothing for, basically. It's paying our taxes. But honestly, if people just paid £5 to pay for the doctor's visit, time to time they visit, that would give a lot of money that should be targeted for IT systems, because basically they don't have a budget system. So unless you have this system data to say, I'm saving here, cannibalizing this, I'm going to substitute over here, they can't make the right decisions. So to address affordability, someone has to be bold enough to start saying to the English population, you need to start paying for your visits. Because if you don't do that, you're not going to fix affordability. The GDP is growing at 2%. The budget bills are growing faster. So unless you do something else to get income, you're going to have to put health treasury bonds out. I'm not sure, but there has to be another mechanism, a financial mechanism. And I think the simplest way is charging people £3-5 for a doctor's visit. On top of the prescription, that will basically double the amount of revenue they get.
Yeah, I can't be really honest. I can't see that happening here because
I
the
know.
NHS is the
I know, but
the jewel,
there's a
right?
wake-up call, but it's,
State religion.
yes,
politics.
Well, it is. It really, and
but you'll spend £1,000 for iPhone X.
I know. It blows my mind. I mean, look, I come from Canada where we also have a fully taxpayer-funded system, but we do have some small top-up payments for certain things, right? So it's not as it's not as much of the jewel as it is here. And I really have thought a lot about this question after moving here 5 years ago, going, why is it so special? And then in the London 2012 Olympics, when you saw the opening ceremonies, and there, it's about showcasing your country, right? About what you're proud of. And there you had big signs, NHS, 1948, and you had all these actors out there with beds and, nurse dressed as nurses. And I was like, that's it. That's what the answer is. Because it's so special to the UK politically, it doesn't matter whether you're on the left or the right, it doesn't matter what party's in power. Nobody is ever going to touch that, right? Because it's political suicide. And I think, in these times of Brexit, no one's going to go there. So I agree. There needs to be another income stream. Because fundamentally, unless you raise taxes, which no one else wants to do either, then where are you going to get the money from with the aging population?
Well, I think something has to be, it's going to kill the country either way, today or tomorrow. And I'd rather be transparency, honesty, is that people should co-pay. I mean, there's different things, spending based on income, your tax rate, whatever it is. There should be some way in which people, if I pay a high tax rate, I don't mind paying a higher fee to see a doctor. But there has to be some mechanism where they get more income. Because if not, we're going to be talking about this, and eventually, oops, everything shuts down. Sorry, and there's no warning. That's the problem. Governments will not tell you a warning when they shut things down.
I'm Shimon Carr. I'm a consultant in a R&D consultancy, but my background is pharma, both big and small, been a medical director, and also a GP and a trained ophthalmologist. So I've got a clinical background, an industry background, a member of the public background, and now I feel like an external observer. And I think this is such an interesting discussion because of all the different challenges that have been encompassed. And I completely agree with Leslie suggesting that one of the simple fixes might be to rechannel PPRS into a dedicated new medicines fund. I don't know why that hasn't happened for years. But the point I really wanted to make is that the part that's missing for me is consideration. We talk about the patient involvement, patient data, but actually we're all members of the public. And the public are not involved in ownership of the NHS or trying to fix its problems. And I think as industry, as all stakeholders, we have a responsibility to try and generate that involvement, help them understand why it's not all about cancer, however brilliant a new treatments are, it's just about rare diseases. And somehow that the voice of the public is missing and people are so ill-informed. Why should do they really want the NHS to fix every sprained ankle and give out tube strips? Or do they want a new cancer treatment if their mother develops
Well,
I'd be really interested in what the panel thinks.
I think it's because they view the NHS as a right, not a privilege. If you change from a right to a privilege, then a lot of things will change. But that's really having a public discourse and people challenging. But politics gets involved. So people need to challenge that. But it really is the notion that this system is a great system. Coming from other countries, I can tell you, you're absolutely right. You know, I remember waiting rooms, you can make appointments, and half the time people in there could see the pharmacist and gotten what they needed. So, you know, I agree with that.
But I think access will be as people fail to gain access, they will have to look for other sources. And we know that disruption will come from digital technologies. We've seen an absolute, I mean, you know, they're not game-changing yet, but in time, the ability to access a GP via a Skype call, I mean, we have however many providers, 10 already, and they're clearly only dealing with the low-hanging fruit, the easy stuff to deal with. But as people start to realise that is a different way to access care, and they develop new ways of managing people with more chronic conditions, then I think that will be some of the shift in mindset, that people realise they can't actually access it through typical routes. They will have to wait 3 weeks for a GP appointment. That's not sustainable, and other requirements. And the prices of that access will come down as well, because there'll be more players in the game. So maybe it's that digital disruption that will help people reevaluate what's important.
I think also paying, even if it's an employer paying for a GP appointment in some way, or a GP visit, will change the relationship between the clinician and the patient. All too often we've all had it, you know, I'm doctor, I know best. Who are you to ask me a question? Oh, sorry, it's my body. And I had to have that discussion with someone not so long ago. And it's about changing that relationship. But who's going to pay? It could be employers, the government won't pay, individuals don't want to pay, but the money has to come from somewhere. Now, you know, companies are always trying to look better and different. And healthcare is a very big issue. You know, you have companies who have free admission to health clubs and so on, and people are running and so on, but they also get sick. And maybe if there was something in there, I don't know if that is the answer or it's a step towards finding the answer, but companies can pay, and they might get tax rebates for providing this sort of care. So all of a sudden there's a system in there of helping the government, helping the patient, who is also an employee, and freeing up some of the times for NHS GPs to see people who can't work, young mothers with children and so on, elderly, etc., all that stuff. So it's about fixing a bit of the system, or taking a bit away to free up something somewhere else.
They'll put Bupa out of business.
I'm sorry. They're not an EMIG member.
No.
So we've got just over 5 minutes left. I don't know if others have more questions from the audience. Anything, areas, I mean, I'm not sure we've provided many solutions, but any areas we haven't covered that you want to explore?
I'm Nicholas. I'm co-founder of Bayflower, based in Hamburg. And one general question is, when you look at a topic like national security, that's where the politicians are saying, oh, that's where I've got to spend the money, because, you know, it's for protection. When I see healthcare, the thought is always, that's where I have to save the money. So is there a way to change the high-level perception that, oh, that's where I got to spend the money, because it's, in general, providing benefits to the country? And then maybe, yeah, is there a way to do it?
I mean, my question would be, is that pushing the whole dialogue up to wellness and prevention, which maybe sits more comfortably than the treatment of people with chronic disease? Is that the investment that governments and authorities will see does have long-term value?
Well, certainly from a cancer perspective, absolutely. You know, the progress that we've made on smoking over the last 30 or 40 years is incredible. But what that's done now is pushed up the agenda, the other biggest preventable cause of cancer being obesity and alcohol, and none of us want to hear that. But, you know,
there has to be some joy in that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. But I think, you know, certainly our ambition in terms of what we want to achieve, we're not going to do it without the prevention agenda becoming much more prominent. It has to.
Yeah, absolutely. At J&J, we have something called disease intervention that we're looking at. The kind of global R&D strategy is to intercept disease before it starts. So using genomics to try and figure out who might be at risk, and also looking at their lifestyle factors as well to say, look, very early on, you're at risk for X, Y, and Z disease. What can we do to actually stop it in its tracks before it gets too late? So, I do see that, combined with digital, as you were saying, as the future of healthcare. So wellness and prevention, stop it before it starts. But yeah, absolutely right. It comes back to the public. Then the public have to believe in it. And that, as you said, the smoking campaign was very successful. Now the public knows this is a bad thing. So I don't know what the answer is, but but absolutely, unless we, no politician's going to change their viewpoint on the NHS until the public tells them to do so. So I think that's the answer.
I mean, you said something that's true. The ticking time bomb globally in the Western world is juvenile obesity. Because that's increasing the rates of diabetes and other problems, and people don't realize it, but it's a huge, you just take the incidence and numbers and start calculating adulthood, that's a massive problem that's going to be in 20 years, and people are not aware of it, they just ignore it, and it's a real big problem, huge ticking time bomb, and the governments won't be able to afford a lot of things then.
And my comment there would be that we tend to categorize that into health and disease issue, but we know it's a social issue, and we know that your postcode is more predictive of your long-term health outcomes than all of the genomic data that we could choose to collate on ourselves. So if we don't start to see, as you pose that question, health in the context of long-term social mobility, we are never ever going to be able to allocate the right budgets or resources. Now, I come back full circle, and we will close here. The fact that you're doing a program, a pilot, in a devolved part of the UK where they are attempting to bring both social and clinical health data together and devolve budgets down to that local region. Well, all I can say is I have enormous hope that will start to bring an insight that says we've got to do things differently, and this is the forward approach. So with that, I think I will thank you for your attention. I hope you found that interesting. I think coffee is waiting for you, so many thanks, and many thanks to my panellists.